late 1941, much of the world was at war. Nazi Germany occupied most of Europe, while Imperial Japan continued to extend its empire throughout Asia. Although the United States government had spoken out against Japanese attacks on China and was supplying Great Britain with food and weapons, many Americans hoped their country would remain neutral. December 7th, 1941, most Americans were enjoying a restful Sunday. Across the nation, people were going to church, listening to the radio, or reading the funny papers. At Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the base of the American Pacific Fleet, most sailors were sleeping late. First by telephone, then by radio, the awful news flashed throughout the United States. Many music lovers heard the dreadful announcement as they tuned into CBS radio for an afternoon concert by the New York Philharmonic. At 7:49 a.m., more than 180 Japanese aircraft began raining bombs on dozens of American warships anchored in the harbor. A second raid an hour later added to the destruction, wiping out a total of 188 U.S. planes and sinking or disabling 19 naval vessels, including 5 battleships. The following day, nearly 60 million Americans tuned in their radios as President Franklin Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. When the president, who regarded December 7th as a day that will live in infamy, asked for a declaration of war against Japan, only one lawmaker voted against it. 3 days after FDR's speech, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. By January 1942, the United States, Great Britain, and 24 other countries, later known as the Allies, had joined together to fight the Axis. Eventually, 6 million men and women volunteered, and 10 million more were drafted. Saying goodbye was a never-ending drama on the home front. As draftees, volunteers left for boot camps, towns organized send-offs at the local train stations. Even military personnel who remained in the United States were usually stationed far from home. To keep lonely young men out of trouble in local saloons, civic leaders invited them and their female cohorts to dances, church socials, and variety shows sponsored by the United Service Organizations. The USO, a joint venture of the government and private charity groups, operated 3,000 clubs in or near military installations throughout the United States and 10 additional canteens overseas. Comedian Bob Hope, dancers Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and movie stars Humphrey Bogart, Errol Flynn, and Boris Karloff traveled to bases around the globe to perform at USO shows. At the Hollywood Canteen and the New York City Stage Door Canteen, stars danced with, waited on, and cleaned up after thousands of grateful men and women in uniform. Initially, many Americans felt that only loose women would join the military, but the overwhelming response of determined, hard-working females began to erode the prejudice of those who thought women could not function in the armed forces. Eventually, female performance in the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, including 16,000 who served overseas, exceeded the highest expectations. Caught unprepared by the Japanese, the United States had to work quickly to provide its armed forces with basic supplies. Many factories had to switch from making household goods to producing war material. To supervise this change, the government created the War Production Board in January 1942. Auto plants soon were able to turn out trucks, tanks, jeeps, and amphibious vehicles. American productivity soared beyond the combined output of all other Allied and Axis countries. But when a shortage of male workers occurred, women filled the gap. Defense plants ran confidence-boosting ads, and Lockheed Aircraft's famous Rosie the Riveter, a poster girl in kerchief and overalls, symbolized a new notion of American beauty. Women performed well at their new jobs, and their presence improved working conditions for all employees. Many towns prepared for air raids. Neighborhood block wardens enforced blackouts. During drills, civilian defense workers sounded alarms. Since few communities had bomb shelters, citizens were told to hide in basements or under tables. The American Red Cross filled the gaps left by public welfare agencies, forming a bridge between those on the home front and loved ones fighting overseas. More than 3 million women volunteered for service, running canteens, assisting as nurses, aides, and ambulance drivers, and packing the legendary Red Cross packages for shipment overseas. Encouraged by the government, homeowners planted more than 20 million backyard victory gardens, which yielded a third of the total U.S. vegetable crop in 1943. During the war, the government had first claim on food and raw materials. Worried that shortages would make prices rise, the Office of Price Administration set limits and began to ration essential goods, such as sugar, coffee, and gasoline. For instance, each person was entitled to 2 pounds of sugar a month and 3 pairs of shoes a year. Families picked up ration coupon books at neighborhood schools. Each coupon was worth a certain number of points. A pound of pork chops might cost 38 cents and 8 red points. Gas rations varied with needs of different groups. Most people qualified for 4 gallons per week. Doctors, police officers, and emergency workers could fill up any time, as did the members of Congress, who incurred the outrage of motorists by voting themselves unlimited use. Shortages and rationing had far-reaching effects. To conserve cloth and metal, dressmakers shortened hems and eliminated cuffs, hoods, and zippers. Pennies turned gray when the U.S. Mint replaced the copper coating with zinc. Ironically, in an effort to defend freedom, the federal government suspended many civil liberties for the duration of the war. And in some cases, minority groups who previously had experienced prejudice saw these injustices magnified by wartime measures. African Americans endured widespread discrimination both at home and at the front. The Army increased the number of black soldiers and formed a few combat units, but most served in segregated construction, food service, transportation, and supply units. As the war progressed, the growing civil rights movement gained the support of many elected officials, but the military was not integrated until President Harry Truman signed it into law in 1948, a step that top brass had resisted. People of European descent also experienced discrimination during the war. Quotas, which had been enacted during the 1920s and 30s to prevent immigrants from taking jobs from unemployed Americans, continued to keep certain ethnic groups, particularly Jews, out of the country. Some Americans feared that California would be invaded by Japan. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, the Army's West Coast commander, claimed that Japanese Americans were planning sabotage and signaling to enemy ships and planes. Although no evidence of this was found, DeWitt insisted on relocating 127,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps. Even though most internees had been born in America, they were forced to sell their homes and businesses. Compensation for their losses was slow in coming. In 1948, Congress paid $37 million in damages, but each surviving internee did not receive their additional $20,000 until 1993. By 1940, news-gathering facilities dotted the globe. Newsreel, 10-minute films covering real-life events, were a principal information source. Enhanced by dramatic narration and music, they were seen weekly by at least 40 million people at home and 200 million people abroad. Hundreds of Hollywood entertainers appeared in films and radio shows, organized scrap drives, and sold war bonds. The Liberty Loan bond drives attracted such stars as Jack Benny, Judy Garland, and James Cagney.
Let's all back the attack.
Entertainers, musicians, and sports figures all wanted to do their part. Jimmy Stewart had joined the Army before Pearl Harbor, but by May 1942, deferments were being granted to Hollywood personnel who were considered essential to the government's propaganda effort. Schools became the focus of many new war-related activities. Students were reminded to save money, to buy war stamps and bonds, serve in volunteer projects, and recycle clothing, paper, and toys. Students followed the course of the war by reading maps, learning to recognize enemy planes, and staging plays. Children also wrote letters to soldiers without families, raised carrier pigeons, drew posters, and wrote patriotic essays. The government encouraged letter writing to boost the morale of military personnel. But since letters took up precious cargo space on ships, the post office introduced the 3-cent V-mail. By microfilming short letters written on special stationery, the Army Signal Corps could reduce shipping weight by 98%. Officials on the receiving end then enlarged and printed the negatives for delivery. Throughout the war, the government screened all letters that might affect national defense. At overseas bases, officers read outgoing mail and snipped out any dates or place names that might reveal a battle plan. Folks on the home front soon grew accustomed to what they called Swiss cheese letters. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had led the United States throughout the war, passed away less than a month before Germany surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Americans across the country celebrated victory in Europe, or VE Day. Although one stage of the war had been won, another, possibly more difficult stage remained. To defeat Japan, the United States planned an invasion likely to produce a horrible number of casualties. Just capturing the tiny island of Okinawa that spring killed almost 7,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines. But the war ended more quickly than anyone expected. On August 6, 1945, under orders from President Harry Truman, the B-29 aircraft Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb devastated Nagasaki. When the Japanese surrendered, jubilation overpowered every other emotion, particularly for this sailor who briefly celebrated with a female passerby in New York's Times Square. On VJ Day, September 2nd, 1945, President Truman declared a 2-day holiday during which banks, factories, stores, and the New York Stock Exchange closed. While movies and magazine covers romanticized the return of U.S. military personnel, the period of transition was often difficult. Veterans needed time to unwind, to make plans, and to acquaint themselves with children whom they had seen only in photographs. Anticipating problems, Congress had passed the Serviceman's Readjustment Act in June 1944. Known as the GI Bill, it enabled veterans to borrow money at low interest, to buy homes or open businesses. Returning servicemen were not prepared to find wives who were disciplined with traditional female roles, and the housing shortage continued. There were no places for young couples who were forced to double up with parents or in-laws. Research and development in the defense industry had led to manufacturing innovations. After the war, TVs, air conditioners, and plastic products became widely available. But science was a double-edged sword. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, which began during the late 1940s, filled people with anxiety. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, former President Herbert Hoover favored providing food relief to the nations being starved by the German army. But Hoover's National Committee on Food for the Small Democracies was ignored by Roosevelt and Churchill, who feared that American food would end up in German stomachs. After Roosevelt declared war in December 1941, Hoover pledged his full support, devoting his energy to plans for a post-war organization to preserve world peace, an international group we now call the United Nations. To provide food relief to devastated Europe after the war, President Truman asked Hoover to head his Famine Emergency Committee. Traveling 50,000 miles, Hoover visited 38 countries, warning the free world that the war would not end until starvation had been defeated. Long before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had begun preparing for war. In 1939, he provided the first of several aid packages to Great Britain and other allies. American involvement in the war was inevitable. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died of a massive heart attack, and as his Vice President Harry Truman took over command, people around the world mourned his passing. Harry Truman never dreamed that he would be president. An obscure Missouri politician, he was elected vice president in 1944 with the help of powerful Democrats and on the strength of his crusade against wasteful wartime spending. Truman served only 82 days as vice president before he took over for the deceased President Roosevelt. Within 4 months, he oversaw the defeat of Nazi Germany, stared down the Soviets at the Potsdam Conference, and ordered the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus ending World War II and ushering in more than 4 decades of Cold War. Able to turn his attention to domestic affairs, Truman dismantled and integrated the military, ended price controls, and promoted full employment. Dwight Eisenhower had served in the military for 31 years before he was appointed Assistant to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall during World War II. In June 1943, Marshall promoted him to commander of all U.S. forces in Europe, and a few months later, Eisenhower had commanded the Allied invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Ike's greatest moment came as Supreme Allied Commander in charge of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of France on June 6, 1944, which ensured the eventual destruction of the Nazi Empire. After the war ended, Eisenhower returned to the United States as a hero. Following his war service with stints as a best-selling author and president of Columbia University, he had only one more goal to accomplish. In 1952, he was elected President of the United States. A scrawny, sickly young man, John F. Kennedy failed the armed forces physical more than once, but he used political influence to receive a Navy commission. During the night of August 2, 1943, Kennedy's patrol boat, PT-109, was sunk by a Japanese destroyer off the Solomon Islands. Left to drown, he towed one of his crewmen to an island 3 miles away. Making sure the rest of his men were safe, he swam from island to island until he got help. Kennedy never fully recovered. After serving in the South Pacific until the spring of 1944, he returned to Boston for a back operation. Although thin and weak, he was remembered as the hero of PT-109. Lyndon B. Johnson was a Texas congressman and a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Refused active duty because he had no combat training, Johnson was asked to work on the Navy's labor and production problems. In May 1942, President Roosevelt sent Johnson on a fact-finding mission to the South Pacific. He met with General Douglas MacArthur in Australia and observed several combat missions at close range, including one during which his plane was attacked. For providing the president with first-hand information, Johnson received a Silver Star from MacArthur. He returned to Congress during the fall of 1942. Although he was entitled to an exemption due to his Quaker beliefs and status as a lawyer with a vital government job, Richard Nixon joined the Navy in August 1942. First assigned to a new naval air station in Ottumwa, Iowa, he joined the South Pacific Air Transport Command on the island of New Caledonia in late 1942. Nixon's duties were dull and routine until early 1944, when he saw some action in the Solomon Islands. At the war's end, he returned to the States, determined to run for Congress. Joining the Navy only hours after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Gerald Ford initially directed physical fitness training for new recruits at a pre-flight school in North Carolina. In June 1943, he was a gunnery and athletics officer on the USS Monterey, a small aircraft carrier attached to Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Ford saw action throughout the Pacific and braved a massive typhoon in December 1944. Before leaving the Monterey, he received a glowing commendation from his captain. After returning to the States, Ford spent his remaining military service at the Glenview Naval Air Station near Chicago. In his memoirs, Jimmy Carter reveals that he decided to join the Navy before he entered grade school. In 1942, he joined the Naval ROTC at Georgia Tech and transferred to the U.S. Naval Academy the following year. Life at Annapolis was difficult, but Carter pressed on to become an expert at recognizing the silhouettes of planes and ships. Each summer, he went out on extensive training exercises in the Atlantic. Carter saw no actual combat, but his training ship was hit by a German torpedo in 1944. After the war, he graduated 59th in a class of 820 in June 1946. He served in the Navy until 1953, when he returned to Georgia. Ronald Reagan was a Warner Brothers contract player and an Army reservist when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Ordered to report to San Francisco's Fort Mason in March 1942, he quickly finished fighting cinematic Nazis alongside Errol Flynn and Alan Hale in Warner's Desperate Journey. Kept stateside because of his poor vision, Reagan served as liaison officer for troop convoys bound for Australia, and then joined an intelligence unit producing training films. Reagan's primary function was to narrate the films, helping to guide bombardier trainees to their targets. He also returned to Warner Brothers to appear in Irving Berlin's This Is the Army, a film that raised $10 million for Army emergency relief in 1945. When George Bush turned 18 on June 12, 1942, he joined the Navy. 1 year later, he became the youngest pilot currently fighting in the war. After being reprimanded for attempting dangerous stunts in his plane, he racked up a distinguished combat record. It was dangerous business, and Bush was one of only 4 in his 14-man squadron to survive the war. In June 1944, he was forced to land at sea, barely escaping before his plane exploded. 3 months later, he again crashed into the sea after his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. With his wings on fire and his crew dead, Bush dropped his bombs on target before he crashed. In December 1944, Bush returned to the States to prepare for the invasion of Japan. But he spent the remainder of the war in Virginia, where he celebrated VJ Day with his wife, Barbara.